Number 5, Genesis is selective history. I said it very intentionally. Genesis is a recountation of history. He's using names and genealogies and locations and places and events in history to validate his claims that this really happened. This isn't story. This isn't myth. This isn't legend. This isn't saga. This is history. This is actual event. This is me, author, recording in the text. So it's author, text, reader, and then you insert history. So author is here, looking at history, writing the text to us who's reading it. So we're reading through the text to see the event the author's recording. Does that make sense? Now, what that means is this. The author is not only recounting a general history of humanity, he's recounting a very specific history. Therefore, he's selective in what he includes. So you've got to understand that Genesis encompasses several thousand years in its story. In the first 3 or 4 chapters, we're going to cover a couple thousand years. And then you got the last 13 chapters that take 13 chapters to tell one guy's story. So you got to follow the pace of the author. Sometimes he'll take an entire chapter to spell out one event that took place on the afternoon in the camp of Abram. And then at the end, he'll throw in one sentence that, boom, spans 4 generations. Do you get that? So the author is giving us a selected view of history because he's looking at the broad expanse of human history, of which it would be impossible to record everything. And he's saying, I'm writing a book with an audience in mind, with a message I want to communicate, so I'm going to intentionally, carefully select certain pieces of the story out of the story, record them so that they understand exactly what I'm trying to communicate. So it's not the intention of the book of Genesis to be an all-encompassing, detailed account of all of human history. It's just not. And if we come to the text forcing those questions on it, then we'll be vastly disappointed because that was never the author's intent. So while he is not exhaustive, he is very intentionally selective. Lastly, number 6, keys to understanding Genesis is that Genesis is a book written by an author to an audience as literature, selecting specific events in history, telling it as a story. So Genesis is a story. If we read it as a textbook, we will miss the main elements he wants us to catch. So any good story writer intentionally includes certain elements of a story. And you know those are intuitively there. You'll go to a movie and you'll come on and you're like, that was hard to follow. I didn't really like it. You might not be able to identify why you didn't like it, but you're a good story consumer. You know a good story when you hear it. You know a good story when you see it. Some of the movies that you like the most are movies that at the end come back to the beginning and realize everything that happened in the middle isn't what you thought it was because of the piece of information you get at the very end, right? Like Inception. It's like, oh, I got to watch it 7 more times. Great storytelling. Beginning, middle, beginning. Beginning, middle, beginning. So Genesis is a story. Does that mean it's not true? Of course not. It's not myth. It's not legend. It's not saga. It's story. Does that mean it's less true? Not at all. You tell stories every day that you expect to be received as true, don't you? What happened today, babe? Well, I responded to some email, and I did some counseling, and I studied for my sermon, and I laid out the next 5-year plan, and I did some strategic planning, and I talked to some pastors on the phone, and then I blah, 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 blah. What am I doing? I'm telling her a story about my day, and I assume that she'll receive it as true because it is. It's what happened in my day. So story is the most common form or vehicle we employ to communicate truth, which means if a good storyteller is doing his job, he's going to set forth things like the setting of the story, the characters of the story, the plot line of the story. Going to introduce some villains, going to introduce some tension, going to introduce a problem, going to introduce some chaos, going to have a hero rise up, going to have the tension almost crush and the evil almost crush the good. And then there'll be a turn in the story and they'll be resolved. The stories that you and I hate worst are the stories with no what? Resolve. I can remember the worst thing that could happen when I was watching the A-Team as a kid. The worst thing. Dun, 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 dun. To be continued. No! Ah! I'm 6 and I gotta know what happens. You know? Are you judging me for watching the A-Team right now? Is that what's happening? Is that what's happening, Adam? All the silence? He watched A-Team when he was 6? Yeah, I did, so get over it. Mr. T is the boss man. Yeah. The stories that drive you crazy are the stories with no resolve. So good stories got to have resolve.